Imagine this. You've been minding your own business, enjoying the peace of your land, when suddenly your neighbor, known for being a Karen, flips out over a fence you build. The reason? She claims it's blocking her private hiking trail on your property. This isn't just a simple neighborhood squabble. It's a full-blown battle of rights where the law and personal boundaries are put to the ultimate test. Buckle up for a story of entitlement, drama, and a clash of wills you won't believe. When I first purchased the land, everything seemed perfect. It was a long-awaited dream come true. After years of searching, I finally found a property that suited all my needs. Peaceful, spacious, and situated far enough from the hustle and bustle of the city. I had envisioned building a beautiful home here, surrounded by a lush garden, with plenty of space for relaxation and quiet moments away from daily distractions. The property came with its own charm. A small, forested section added a sense of privacy and seclusion that I loved. It was perfect for morning walks, watching the sunset, or simply unwinding after a long day. Little did I know, this forested area came with an unexpected complication. An old hiking trail that had been used by the neighborhood for years. The trail, as I soon discovered, was not marked or officially recognized. The previous owners of the land had never made any arrangements or granted formal permission for others to use the trail. It had simply become a well-established path over time, with neighbors walking through it as part of their daily routines. The trail wound its way through the wooded area, offering a shortcut for those living nearby to access the hills and scenic views. The land had become a de facto part of the community, though no official easement or right-of-way had ever been granted. When I first set eyes on the property, I knew that I wanted to make it my own. As much as I enjoyed the natural beauty of the land, I also wanted to define its boundaries clearly. I didn't have any intentions of cutting off access to the trail. My plan was simple. I would build a fence around the perimeter of the property to establish a boundary between my land and the rest of the neighborhood. A simple fence would mark the line and give me the sense of privacy I sought while still allowing others to enjoy the trail. I didn't think much about the trail at first. I assumed the neighborhood had long since stopped using it as a frequent path, considering that most of the trail was overgrown with weeds and the trees had grown thick over the years. I had no intention of disturbing anyone's way of life, but I did want to make sure that my property was secure and well-defined. So, I set to work on the fence, making sure to mark the line with precision. It wasn't a large project. I was just putting in fence posts to clearly define my land. There was no reason to think that anyone would mind, especially since the land was mine, and I had every right to make changes to it as I saw fit. Everything went smoothly at first. I was excited about the new chapter that was unfolding, and I was eager to get the fence up so I could move on to my next plans, building the house and creating the sanctuary I had always dreamed of. However, things started to change the moment I began putting in the first few posts. A sense of unease began to settle in. As I worked on the fence, I noticed a few neighbors walking by, looking at the posts curiously. I smiled and waved, assuming they were just taking in the changes I was making. But as I continued, I began to feel like there was something off. The look on some of their faces seemed a little more serious than I had anticipated. It was almost as if they were waiting for something I hadn't yet realized. The tension remained subtle, but it was there. One day, as I finished setting up a few posts, I heard a voice calling out from behind me. It was Mrs. Thompson, one of the neighbors from down the street. She was walking down the trail with her dog and appeared to be in quite a hurry. I thought she might just be passing by, but instead she stopped a few feet away from where I was working. Her expression was hard to read, but she seemed bothered by something. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, she had seen the fence posts going up for a few days now. It was an ordinary construction project. Nothing more, nothing less. But as she stood there looking at the posts, I could sense that something was on her mind. I stopped what I was doing and gave her a friendly smile, but she didn't return it. Instead, she asked me if I was planning to block off the trail entirely. I was taken aback by her question. I explained that I was just marking the property line and that the trail, while there, wasn't officially recognized. I told her that I had no intention of closing it off completely. She seemed to relax a little, but the doubt in her eyes never fully left. I wasn't sure what to make of it at the time, but I brushed it off and continued working. After all, it was just a fence, and I was following the rules of ownership. I thought that was the end of it, but as I went to bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing under the surface. I had no idea that this seemingly small project would soon spiral into something much bigger than I could have ever imagined. What I had thought would be a simple boundary-setting task was about to ignite a firestorm of conflict and legal battles, all because of an old trail that I never thought twice about. As the days passed, I noticed more and more people walking by, glancing at the posts with growing interest. Little did I know Mrs. Thompson was only the beginning. The calm before the storm was over, and what was once a peaceful project was now about to become a full-blown neighborhood dispute. The next morning, the situation took a dramatic turn. Mrs. Thompson, a vocal and self-appointed leader of the neighborhood, quickly became the center of the dispute. She arrived at my property, visibly upset, and immediately began making loud, emotional statements about how I was ruining the community's hiking trail. Her words were heated, and it was clear that she had no intention of simply voicing a polite complaint. Her anger seemed disproportionate to the situation, as if her very identity was tied to this trail. According to Mrs. Thompson, she had been walking on this trail for years. She claimed it was a public path that belonged to the neighborhood, despite the fact that no legal documents, easements, or agreements supported her assertion. In her eyes, the trail wasn't just a path. It was a part of the community's shared history, an almost sacred space that had been passed down for generations. She spoke with such authority that I started questioning whether I had missed something. Had I overlooked some long-standing tradition or understanding? But my reality was grounded in legal fact. This was my property, and I had every right to make improvements to it as I saw fit. Mrs. Thompson's complaints quickly turned into accusations, alleging that I was violating some unwritten rule of the neighborhood. She suggested that my fence was an act of aggression, something that disrupted the harmony of the community and dishonored the shared experience that everyone had with the trail. It was baffling. To me, the fence was a simple boundary marker, something that would help define my property. I never intended to disturb anyone's way of life, especially since I had no intention of permanently blocking the trail. Yet Mrs. Thompson insisted that my actions were a betrayal of the neighborhood's values. She told me that my fence wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an insult to everything the community stood for. I attempted to calmly explain that the land was mine, and as the owner I had the right to build a fence. I tried to reason with her, assuring her that I wasn't planning to completely block off the trail. I just wanted a clear boundary between my property and the neighborhood. But she wasn't interested in hearing me out. Her response was a vehement declaration that I was breaking the community rules by building the fence. She accused me of being inconsiderate, selfish, and of ignoring the unspoken agreement that had existed for years, that the trail was a communal space, available for anyone who wished to use it. Frustratingly, it became clear that the issue wasn't as simple as a fence or property boundaries. It was about a sense of entitlement that Mrs. Thompson seemed to have toward the land, despite the lack of any legal basis for her claim. Her arguments were based on emotion and tradition, not legality. However, she made it clear that her belief in the trail's public status was something that had been ingrained in her and others over the years. It seemed as if, to her, the very idea of changing or limiting access to the trail was a personal affront, an attack on the community itself. What made matters worse was her next step. She reached out to the Homeowners Association, HOA. Without even attempting to resolve the issue directly with me, Mrs. Thompson went over my head and brought the situation to the HOA's attention. She claimed that my actions were in violation of community rules, even though those rules didn't explicitly cover this type of situation. She insisted that the HOA intervene, alleging that I was acting outside of the community guidelines by restricting access to what she believed was a shared public space. This was a turning point. The HOA's involvement shifted the dynamic of the dispute. I had always thought of my property as mine, with the freedom to make whatever changes I felt were necessary. Now, the HOA, an organization that was supposed to maintain community standards, was suddenly involved in a disagreement over something as personal as property rights. I had never considered the possibility that my simple decision to build a fence would turn into a community-wide issue, one that could potentially escalate into a legal battle. But Mrs. Thompson didn't stop there. Her determination to frame the situation as a violation of community rules was relentless. She used the HOA to build a case against me, alleging that my fence would block the trail, despite the fact that the path had never been designated or legally acknowledged as a public easement. This became the crux of the argument. Was the trail truly public, or was it simply an informal path that had been used by a few people over time? Mrs. Thompson's version of events, though based on years of personal experience, had no legal standing. Nevertheless, she managed to convince some members of the HOA to sympathize with her viewpoint, turning my simple act of property improvement into a larger, more contentious issue. At this point, I felt cornered. The HOA had now become involved, and I was forced to navigate a maze of community regulations and personal accusations. I was being painted as the villain in a narrative that was far removed from the reality of the situation. All I wanted was to secure my property, but instead, I found myself locked in a battle over the ownership of a trail that wasn't even officially recognized. As the HOA discussions began, the pressure mounted. I knew that I had to act fast to protect my rights and ensure that my property boundaries were respected. Mrs. Thompson had made it clear that she wasn't going to back down easily. It was no longer just about a fence. It had become a fight over my right to control my own land. And as the HOA began to take sides, it was becoming increasingly clear that this conflict wasn't going to be resolved quietly. The escalation of the situation came swiftly as the Homeowners Association, HOA, became deeply involved. The involvement of the HOA added a new layer of complexity to the issue, turning what had started as a personal dispute over property boundaries into a community-wide controversy. It became clear that this was no longer just about a fence. The HOA's response was immediate and aggressive, with a flood of emails and calls directed at me from both supporters of Mrs. Thompson and other neighbors who had previously stayed out of the discussion. Some neighbors who had never even used the trail began weighing in, offering unsolicited opinions on what I was doing. Many of them, however, had no legal standing in the matter and had no real stake in whether or not the trail continued to exist. Despite this, they sided with Mrs. Thompson, whose emotional appeal and passionate speech about the rights of the community seemed to resonate with some members of the HOA. The situation quickly became polarizing. Some neighbors expressed support for my rights as the landowner, while others seemed to see this as a simple case of me being inconsiderate, not understanding the community history tied to the trail. Despite my best efforts to explain that the land and the trail were not legally tied to any public easement, the HOA sent me a formal letter. The letter claimed that I had violated some implied easement, asserting that I had blocked a public trail and was therefore in violation of the community's expectations and, by extension, the HOA's guidelines. The letter demanded that I tear down the fence immediately or face legal action. This accusation left me in disbelief. There was no easement. The property deed clearly indicated my full ownership of the land, giving me the legal right to build a fence and establish boundaries as I saw fit. I had the full right to develop the land, yet the HOA's stance heavily influenced by Mrs. Thompson's claim to the trail, ignored the legal facts. Their support of her view was based not on any formal legal claim, but rather on emotional appeals about community history, a vague notion of shared space, and the presumed ownership of the trail that had never been legally documented or formalized. The more I reviewed the situation, the more it became evident that this was not about a mere property dispute. What had begun as a simple decision to build a fence had transformed into a much larger issue of property rights, legal boundaries, and the preservation of personal space. It was no longer a question of whether my fence was blocking a trail. It was about whether people could claim ownership of a space based on tradition, assumption, or personal beliefs. Without any legal standing or clear documentation, I began to feel as though the HOA was attempting to impose rules that didn't exist and were based on personal interpretation rather than actual law. The concept that a community, or an individual, within it could assert rights over another's land simply because they had always used it was deeply concerning. It made me question how many times others in the community had made similar claims and how many had accepted these claims without question. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, I sought legal counsel to make sure I understood my rights and how best to proceed. My lawyer and I went over the facts, analyzing the property deed, the legal definition of easements, and property rights. It was clear that my ownership of the land was not in dispute, and there was no legal justification for the HOA or anyone else to demand the removal of the fence. It was my land, and I had every right to protect it and establish boundaries as I saw fit. However, the legal process was not simple. While I had the law on my side, the HOA's influence in the community, combined with Mrs. Thompson's strong arguments and the support she had gained from some of the neighbors, made the situation feel increasingly hostile. This wasn't just a legal issue. It was becoming a social and psychological battle over how much control a person could exert over their property. As the HOA became more involved, I realized that this conflict was about more than just a fence or a trail. It was about the principles of ownership, entitlement, and the right to define one's own space. As I prepared to fight back, I understood that this would not be resolved easily. It was not just about the immediate dispute over the trail, but about the broader issue of respect for personal property and the right to make decisions regarding one's own land. The situation had escalated beyond what I initially anticipated, and the stakes had grown considerably. It was now clear that this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was a confrontation about personal rights, boundaries, and the extent to which others could encroach on one's property based on unwritten expectations or assumptions. The HOA, in siding with Mrs. Thompson and other sympathetic neighbors, had overstepped its bounds. They had allowed themselves to be swayed by emotions and assumptions instead of the clear legal facts. I was prepared to stand my ground not just for myself, but for the principle that personal property rights should be respected regardless of the emotional or historical attachments others might have to a particular piece of land. What had begun as a small, seemingly insignificant dispute had now turned into a test of legal rights, community dynamics, and the power of entitlement. As the situation progressed, it became clear that the legal battle would be a long and challenging process. Mrs. Thompson, supported by the HOA, hired a lawyer to press her case. The lawsuit was filed, and the case was set to go to court. From the outset, it was evident that the stakes were high for both sides. Mrs. Thompson was adamant about her claims, and the HOA, despite the lack of legal documentation supporting her assertions, appeared to back her. On the other hand, my legal team and I were prepared to challenge these claims with a strong defense grounded in property law, the lack of any formal easement, and the simple fact that the land, including the trail, was mine. We started by meticulously gathering all relevant documents related to the property. My lawyer and I combed through the deed, the land records, and any local zoning laws that might apply. Everything we found pointed to one clear fact. There was no easement or legal recognition of the trail as a public right-of-way. The land was fully and legally mine, and I had every right to build a fence to establish boundaries. The absence of any formal agreement or legal claim to the trail meant that there was no legal basis for Mrs. Thompson's accusations. She had no official right to the land, and her emotional claims about community tradition were not enough to override my legal rights as the owner of the property. But Mrs. Thompson wasn't giving up easily. Her legal team quickly shifted the focus of the case from property rights to the concept of historic use. She argued that the trail had been used by the community for decades, and because of this, it should be considered a public right-of-way, even though no legal agreement or formal easement had ever been established. Her lawyer emphasized that the community's emotional connection to the trail should be enough to establish its legitimacy, making it a shared space that could not be blocked by the property owner. The legal argument presented was one of tradition and long-standing use, but it lacked the legal documentation necessary to support it. In addition to Mrs. Thompson's own testimony, several sympathetic neighbors were brought in to support her case. They testified about their personal experiences using the trail and how it had been a common practice for many years. Some claimed they had been walking the trail since they were children and that the trail had always been open to the public. However, these testimonies, while heartfelt, were purely anecdotal and lacked any legal standing. The fact remained that the trail had never been officially designated as a public pathway, nor had it been included in any public records. Their personal experiences and memories, while important to them, did not hold weight in the eyes of the law. My legal team, in contrast, focused on the clear legal facts. The property was mine, the land was unencumbered by any easement, and I had the right to build a fence as part of my property rights. We argued that Mrs. Thompson's emotional attachment to the trail could not override my legal ownership, and that allowing the trail to be treated as a public space without any legal documentation would set a dangerous precedent. We emphasized that property rights are fundamental, and allowing someone to claim ownership of a part of private land simply based on tradition and personal use would open the door for others to make similar claims, potentially undermining property ownership laws. The legal proceedings themselves were grueling. The courtroom became a battleground where the law, emotion, and personal convictions collided. On one side, Mrs. Thompson and her supporters argued passionately for the trail's historical importance to the community, while my legal team focused on the hard facts and the legal rights I held as the landowner. Emotions ran high, especially when the community began to rally around Mrs. Thompson. Some of the neighbors viewed this as a fight for the preservation of a shared legacy, while others, including myself, saw it as a struggle to protect individual property rights and prevent the erosion of ownership. At times, it felt as though the legal system was secondary to the deeply personal nature of the dispute. Mrs. Thompson and her supporters were not simply fighting for the trail, they were fighting for their connection to it, their memories, and their belief that it belonged to them. In contrast, I wasn't just defending a fence. I was defending my right to control my land and the principle that personal property cannot be taken by assumption or emotion. It was clear that the case wasn't just about a fence or a trail anymore. It had evolved into a larger debate about the intersection of legal rights and emotional attachment, community traditions, and personal ownership. The longer the case went on, the more it became about principle, the principle of property rights versus the principle of community tradition. My lawyer and I were focused on the legal facts, but we knew that winning this case wouldn't just be about what was written on paper. It was about challenging a cultural belief that personal ownership could be overridden by communal desire. Despite the emotional tension, my legal team remained confident that the law was on our side. The evidence we presented, including the lack of any formal easement and the clear property rights granted to me as the owner, left little room for doubt. Mrs. Thompson's case was built on historical use, not legal standing, and in the end, the law would have to prevail. As the trial continued, I began to realize that this battle wasn't just about this one piece of land. It was about the principles that underpinned property ownership and the protection of individual rights in the face of public opinion. I wasn't just defending my fence. I was defending the notion that private property should not be subject to unwarranted claims, no matter how strongly those claims are felt by others. The legal battle finally reached its culmination after several months of back-and-forth negotiations, filings, and courtroom hearings. The tension in the air was palpable as the day of the trial arrived. Both sides had made their arguments, and it was clear that this case was more than just about the fence. It had become a test of personal property rights, community claims, and the application of the law. Mrs. Thompson, with the support of the HOA, continued to advocate passionately for the trail's importance to the neighborhood. She argued that her claim was not just about the land, but about the emotional connection the community had with the trail, framing it as a historical and cultural space that had always belonged to the public. Her argument was one of tradition and shared history, trying to paint the trail as an unspoken communal right that could not be disregarded by any single landowner. On the other hand, my legal team remained focused on the hard facts of the case. The law was clear, the property was mine, the trail had no official easement, and I had every right to build the fence that marked the boundaries of my land. My lawyer meticulously presented evidence, including the property deed, zoning laws, and the absence of any formal claim to the trail, arguing that Mrs. Thompson's emotional appeal could not override legal ownership. The defense was straightforward and grounded in property law. Ownership of land comes with the right to use it as one sees fit, and that includes the ability to build fences, gates, and other structures to define one's space. The battle in the courtroom was tough. Mrs. Thompson's lawyer tried to shift the focus away from legal ownership and onto the emotional value of the trail, claiming that the community's use of the space for generations was enough to create a sort of prescriptive easement. They argued that the trail should be considered public because it had been used by the neighborhood for so long, despite the lack of any official designation or agreement. However, the lack of legal documentation for such a claim became a weakness in their argument. Mrs. Thompson's testimony, while heartfelt, lacked any legal basis, and the absence of a formal easement on the property could not be ignored. The judge carefully considered both sides. The emotional arguments of the community and Mrs. Thompson were compelling, but in the end, the law was clear and unwavering. The judge ruled in my favor, stating that the property was legally mine and that I had the right to make decisions about its use, including the construction of the fence. The court acknowledged that while the trail had been historically used by the neighborhood, there was no legal claim to it and no formal easement had ever been established. Mrs. Thompson's claim to the private trail was dismissed, and the court made it clear that personal property rights must be respected regardless of community tradition or emotional attachment. Furthermore, the HOA, which had supported Mrs. Thompson's case, was ordered to cover my legal fees, as the court determined that their involvement in backing an unfounded claim had unnecessarily escalated the situation. The ruling sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Many of the neighbors who had been sympathetic to Mrs. Thompson and her cause were disappointed with the decision. They had hoped that the emotional and historical significance of the trail would be enough to sway the court in their favor. Some expressed frustration at the idea that personal property rights could override what they saw as a shared community space. However, there were also many who respected the ruling, recognizing that the law had been applied fairly and that the property rights of individuals must be respected, even if it conflicted with long-standing community traditions. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, the neighborhood experienced a period of tension. There was some lingering animosity between Mrs. Thompson and the neighbors who had supported her, and some of the residents who were upset by the outcome made it known. But as time passed, things gradually began to settle. I was able to maintain my fence, which not only served as a clear boundary for my property, but also symbolized my right to protect and define the space I owned. With the legal ruling in my favor, I could finally move forward with my plans to develop the land and build the home I had always dreamed of. Although the neighborhood returned to a sense of normalcy, the case had left an indelible mark on me. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about property rights, entitlement, and standing up for what is legally and morally mine. I had learned that sometimes standing your ground is necessary, even when the people around you are emotionally invested in a different outcome. It had also reinforced the importance of understanding and respecting the legal boundaries that govern land ownership, and that emotional claims, no matter how deeply felt, cannot override the law. Looking back, I realized that this case wasn't just about protecting a piece of land or defending a fence. It was a deeper lesson in asserting my rights, respecting legal boundaries, and navigating the often complicated intersection of personal property and community expectations. The case had been draining, but it had also been a victory. Not just for me, but for the principle that personal property rights are foundational and should not be easily dismissed, no matter the emotional or historical significance others attach to a space. The community, though initially shaken, began to respect the ruling as time went on. Some neighbors, having seen the importance of upholding property rights, started to understand the decision, even if they didn't completely agree with it. For me, the experience served as a reminder that property is not just about land. It's about asserting one's rights and ensuring that those rights are protected, even in the face of resistance. Never again would I let someone challenge my ownership or my right to make decisions about my land. It was a hard-fought battle, but in the end, I knew that I had done what was right. If you enjoyed this drama and want to see more stories about HOA conflicts, property rights, and Karen confrontations, make sure to subscribe to my channel, The HOA Stories. You won't want to miss the next insane showdown.